Just saying in my other video how classic autism is extremely rare. Asperger's is a lot more common. And yet, although the two conditions might share some features in common and may possibly in some cases share some genes, and may possibly in some cases cluster together with families, but not in all families, that these conditions actually may well be completely different, and it makes no sense calling them the same thing. That was the first thing I wanted to suggest. The other thing is that we don't really know what autism is. Autism is a really young condition. Psychiatry is very young, but autism is even younger. We don't really know what it is. People often talk about as though they know exactly what autism is, and yet because there are so many different conditions all called autism, it gets incredibly confusing. I mean, we have a far greater idea what classic autism is. That's pretty obvious, but it's not. But when we talk about autism in the general, we really don't know what we're talking about, because we don't know that all these conditions are the same. We might be talking about conditions as disparate from one another as depression is from schizophrenia. And if that is the case, then it makes no sense treating them all the same and doing research on them and calling it all the same condition. It makes absolutely no sense at all. Ironically, the neurodiversity movement, for all its dislike of medical language, uses medical language all the time to talk about neurodivergence, neurotypical. That's very medical language, but we don't know what neurotypical is. We don't even know where in the brain autism is. That hasn't been found out either. We assume it's in the brain, and we've got very good grounds for assuming it's in the brain. Very good grounds, but as any scientist would say, you can only ever be very, very certain. We can't be absolute about it. That is just Occam's razor, the most likely explanation, and yet we don't know where in the brain this autism is to be found. It hasn't been found yet. Unfortunately, the neurodiversity movement is stemming neuroscientific work because of their dislike of medical labels, so it's likely that we're not going to get any further along the road to actually understanding what the hell autism is. And as I said before, when I talk about what autism is, bear in mind, this isn't just one autism. This is potentially hundreds of different types of conditions that are all being described as autism, which makes it even more confusing. So we don't know what autism is, and yet the neurodiversity people use very medical language, despite their dislike of medical language, which is rather ironic. So, neurodiversity and all of that. But what the hell is this neurodiversity, where we don't even know where in the brain it is anyway? And everyone's neurodiverse. That's a fact. No two brains are alike. All brains are different. So that isn't special. They talk about neurodivergence to distinguish those who are radically different as opposed to just the usual run-of-the-mill neurodiversity. But that doesn't really clarify matters at all, actually. And they also talk about autism as being a natural variation. Yeah, that's true. Autism is a natural variation, but as I said in another video, so are many other conditions. So sickle cell anemia, that's a natural variation. If you have sickle cell anemia, you actually have some protection against malaria. It's a natural variation in the gene pool. But I wouldn't want to have sickle cell anemia. No, thank you. Even if I do have a bit of protection against malaria, I don't want sickle cell anemia. I'm glad I don't have it. It's still a natural variation, though. So that's a logical fallacy. Just because something is natural, it does not mean it's harmless. I guess there are natural variations that are harmless, hair colour being one, skin colour being another, your sexual orientation. All of these things are harmless. Obviously, sexual orientation has been discriminated against, but that's societal influences. There's nothing harmful in and of itself about your sexual orientation. So all of these things, they're benign natural variations. So category mistake. So there are two category mistakes here really, and also logical fallacies. The first thing is that just because something is natural does not in and of itself mean it's harmless, as I said with sickle cell anemia. The other category mistake and logical fallacy is treating autism the same as benign differences such as hair colour and skin colour. They're all natural variations, but skin colour and hair colour are benign and harmless, don't cause any problems to the person. Whereas obviously there can be discrimination against, say, if you have a darker skin colour or so on, that you can face discrimination and prejudice in society, but there's nothing harmful in and of itself about having a darker skin tone, for example. So it's a logical fallacy treating autism like the same as those, because irrespective of whether an autistic is discriminated against, being autistic can still cause harm, regardless of what society you live in. Now, the other thing that they often compare it to is height. That's a common... People in the neurodiversity movement will often compare autism to height as talking about like a natural variation. So yeah, so height is an example of a natural variation, and autism is also a natural variation. Like autism, you could say that height occurs on a continuum, from short to tall. And if you were to take, say social impairment, for example, or I should say here, to be more accurate, social skill, there's a massive variety in a general population as to how socially skilled someone is, okay? Most of these people will not be autistic. In the general population, though, it is perfectly normal for there to be a variety of skills. So some totally, non-autistic people, some of them won't be that great at socialising. Might be a bit socially awkward, some might be very literal, some might be very sensitive, some might need routine, and so on. All of these things exist in the general population. It's part of a sort of bell curve of diversity. And most people are sort of in that middle, sort of clustering in that middle ground. All diverse, neurodiversity, okay? But at the extremes of that bell curve, at one end of that bell curve, at the very, very extreme end of that bell curve, you get people who are so socially incapacitated that it's no longer just a natural variation. It is still a natural variation, but it's no longer just a natural variation. It actually becomes an abnormality in two senses of the word. It becomes an abnormality both because it's rare. Most people are not that socially incapacitated, because if they were, the world would come to a stop. So it's both rare, in that sense of the word of being abnormal, but it also could cause harm. The individual can end up suffering and have less opportunities in life because of that social abnormality. So it definitely becomes a pathology, to use medical language. Medical language the NDM don't like, well, ironically using it to talk about neuro this and neuro that without any real understanding about what they're talking about. So it actually becomes a pathology once you get that extreme. To use an analogy with height, most people are neither absolutely tall or absolutely short. They're somewhere in that middle, so it's always relative. Some people are taller, some people are shorter. At the extremes of the bell curve, you have dwarfism, and you have people who are so extremely tall it becomes a medical problem, and there are various medical conditions that can cause someone to be extremely tall, way more than what's normal. That's where it becomes abnormal. Not all short people are dwarfs, just as not all socially incapacitated people are autistic. Actually, I shouldn't even use the word socially incapacitated for that. I should say socially awkward, because to be incapacitated, by definition, you sort of need to be autistic. So not all socially awkward people are autistic, and not all short people are dwarfs, okay? Because dwarfism is a medical condition. Not only is the person extremely short, but they also have other medical problems, like they can be prone to certain medical conditions affecting their ligaments and all sorts of other things. It's a medical condition with biomarkers. You either are a dwarf or you're not a dwarf. Same as if you're autistic. You're either autistic or you're not autistic, even though social skill operates along a continuum. So there's both a continuum, but there's also a binary. And a binary exists when you meet these very medical conditions where there is a very clear categorical break. So the two don't cancel each other out. Yes, it's a continuum, but at the extremes of that continuum, you have a categorical break. And that is caused by something very specific. The difference is that with dwarfism, we know what causes it. I'm not going to say what causes it because I'm not an expert on dwarfism, but I do know that they know there is a very clear genetics behind it, okay? With autism, we have very good grounds for assuming it's genetics. That's the consensus, but we don't yet really know exactly what is causing it. And the reason for that is, as I said before, because we don't really know what autism is, and we're calling all of these conditions autism without really taking into account that they probably are not the same condition. So dwarfism is a natural variation, but it's also abnormal. And the same I would say for autism, okay, to compare it as an analogy. So height is a continuum like social skill, but at the extreme, we have clear categorical medical conditions causing extremes of tallness or shortness, which are abnormal, rare, and cause problems. But it's still a natural variation. You can say the same things without contradiction. And I would say the same with autism. The difference is that with autism, and I use autism in big air quotes because this thing we call autism is a social construct. The conditions it causes are real, all too real, and very probably in the brain. But we don't actually know what we're really talking about, so that's why I use autism in big quotes, because we're likely not talking about the same condition, and therefore we probably do need different labels for all of these different conditions in the future, and maybe we should stop calling them the same name. So thank you for watching.